Hey guys, how's it going? It's Leon here. Today I'm going to talk about how you could reduce urges, cravings, bad habits, or you have intense ongoing negative emotions of anger and anxiety, what you could do to reduce these. I'm sure a lot of people have the experience of trying to pick on their urges, cravings, or habits before, or emotions such as these, but find it to be really difficult to do so. So the good news is that there's a lot of great research out there about what are the effective means to be able to do this. And I've used the approaches I'm going to share with you here with my clients, and I believe tend to be pretty effective. And they come from different therapies. So I'll be combining approaches from different therapies here, from ACT therapy to dialectical behavioral therapy, CBT, and also the work of Judson Brewer, who's a really great neuroscientist who speaks about this matter. So Judson Brewer, the neuroscientist, he makes this really great point that what people struggle with is that they often try to use their mind to control their behavior. And this is something that may be very familiar to you. Certainly, I've experienced this before, is that we use our minds to try to talk ourselves into trying to reduce our urges or cravings or bad habits, or like when we're experiencing these intense emotions, but it doesn't tend to work. No matter how much we try to chastise ourselves or try to direct ourselves using our minds, it's not very effective. And what he says here is that the reason why this does not work that well is that the mind is the first thing that goes offline when we get stressed out. When we're in that midst of that urge, when we're in that midst of the craving or the habit or the emotion, our minds are checked out then, and we start to lose control. And he speaks about, instead of using this top-down approach from the mind to tell us how to reduce these things, how can we do it from a place where we're feeling it intrinsically from a really internal place? So he shares how to do this. He has this really great TED talk on this. It's called A Simple Way to Break a Bad Habit. I have a link to the TEDx talk up above and also down below in the description box. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what he says, but also introduce how these therapies help in doing this, approaching this from this intrinsic level. So Judson Brewer has this really great example about how smokers are able to quit smoking. And what he has found is that when smokers try to control themselves from the level of the mind, when they're telling themselves, don't smoke, don't smoke, don't smoke, that tends not to work at all. However, when smokers mindfully pay attention to the experience while smoking, so even allow themselves to smoke and really pay attention to how it feels like at a really visceral level. And when they do so, they realize they don't really like the experience, that the smoke kind of tastes to them like cheesy chemicals, and they don't like it at all. That makes it much easier to start to quit the habit when it comes from that more internal source. So how can you apply this example from smoking into your own life? Well, you could take the time to observe the urge, the craving, the bad habit, or the strong emotion that you have, and just really become mindfully aware of it, to rest in that experience, to allow yourself to be with that experience without trying to fix it using your mind, without trying to chastise yourself and criticize yourself into changing it. It takes time to change a habit. We're not going to change this thing overnight. So take your time to mindfully observe it. And people think that if I'm mindfully observing it, that means I have to embrace this experience. That's not the case. You don't have to like your urge. You don't have to like your craving. You don't have to like that experience of having that strong negative emotion. Not at all. You take that time to mindfully observe it and allow it to be there and to rest in that experience. You could even say to yourself while you're resting in experience, I don't like this experience. I don't have to like it, but I'm going to allow myself to rest in it. So something that could help facilitate this mindfulness is to be able to fill in the blank when it comes to the following things. Tell yourself, I notice my mind is. Perhaps when you're having that urge or doing that bad habit or having that intense feeling of anger, I notice my mind is getting distracted, getting unfocused. And you start to really pay attention to how it's like when your mind's distracted and unfocused in a moment. I notice that I feel. So while this is happening, I notice that I'm feeling really upset. I'm feeling really tense and stressed out, right? Just really pay attention to how that is like at an emotional level. Next one is I notice my body. I notice my body is getting tense. I'm getting really tense, especially around the chest or in my head. The reason why you want to be able to do this is that you start to become aware of what's happening internally when this is happening. So just like how the smokers are paying attention to how that smoke is really like to them, you're paying attention to how it's really like to you. So rather than try to talk yourself into changing this, you can really pay attention to that experience and whether this is something that you like or not. So when your mind's getting really unfocused and distracted, you realize I don't really like when that happens. I don't really like when I'm feeling distressed like this, or my body's really cleansing up. So you may say, of course, I know that I don't like my bad habit. I don't like my craving. The thing is, of course, you know that at an intellectual, mental level, or you might try to tell yourself this at that mental level, but that's not going to be helpful. It's going to be more helpful to become mindful of that experience of the bad habit or craving in that moment and really feel at a visceral level how you don't like it. And of course, there's certain things that might feel good in the moment, but later on, they don't feel good. So maybe you have some fast food and you enjoy it in a moment, but you could really pay attention to become mindful of after you have that fast food. How is that experience like for you when your mind starts to become sluggish, when your body starts to become sluggish? So instead of criticizing yourselves at a mental level about having that fast food, just to pay attention to the consequence of it in the moment, to not try to think ourselves out of the bad habit or craving, but to allow ourselves to feel it and experience it mindfully. So the issue with using the mind is that we tend to get really harsh on ourselves. Our minds get really, really critical about our own bad habit, our urge, our emotion. And the thing is, though, is that this urge that we have, this craving we have, this negative emotion is very automatic. It's very ingrained. So when we're criticizing ourselves, it's almost like this. It's almost as if every single time I sneeze, I blink, right? Blinking is a normal reaction to when you sneeze. So it's almost like if I am being very critical at myself for blinking every single time I'm sneezing. It happens in this moment that this urge, this craving, this strong emotion is an automatic and ingrained behavior. So it doesn't make sense to be critical of it. So criticalness actually does not work. And it could even reinforce the behavior. The reason why it reinforces the behavior is that when we're in the midst of that urge, of that craving, of that habit, of that strong emotion, we're very stressed. And when we're very stressed, we don't want to hear that critical voice. So that critical voice goes offline. We want to kind of shut it off and we get into a really mindless state of engaging in this behavior. So becoming mindful reverses this. Becoming mindful allows us to become aware of what is going on when we are doing this behavior. So the critical mind leads to mindlessness, whereas mindfulness does the opposite. It leads to awareness. So the reason why we have an urge or craving or bad habit, or we have intense emotion like anger, is that these things allow us to temporarily escape from stress. So for example, say that you're feeling anxiety. So you're feeling anxiety that's really stressing you out. And so you go onto social media or you start to binge eat or you start to smoke to temporarily relieve that stress. So the problem is low stress tolerance. So when you become mindful, what you're doing is that you're allowing yourself to sit with that stress, to sit with that anxiety for longer, not to resist the emotion, but to start to build tolerance towards it. So this is like systematic desensitization, that you start to tolerate the distress over time. Again, the goal is not to immediately change that behavior right away. That tends not to work. What you could do, though, is that you could start to sit with that stress for longer. And then maybe, yes, you do go on to your coping behavior, start to go onto social media or binge or smoke, whatever you engage in. But what you could do is that you could even observe yourself engage in these temporary coping mechanisms to see how that experience is like for you. So before I move on to talk about like what can you start to do to start to adjust your behavior, I want you to kind of just focus on this first part I'm talking about on the mindfulness. We tend to really want to rush. We want to get to the solution. It's important to be patient here, to take the time to practice the mindfulness, because when you do that, the next part is going to be easier. So just take perhaps the first week to mindfully observe the behavior. And something that could help with you is that when you're experiencing the tension in your chest or in your head, when you're engaging in the behavior, what you could do is that you could breathe into the feeling, and that could provide you with some relief. So now we could talk about what you could do to change this behavior. So what you could do is to ask the following questions to yourself with compassion while you are mindfully observing your urge, your craving, or your intense anger, what may it be. You ask yourself, how is this experience like? Does it add anything to my life? Do I gain anything useful from it? Does it help me be the person that I want to be? Does it help me live the life that I value? So when you ask these questions, ask yourself these questions in a curious and oh so kind-hearted manner. And when you answer these questions in a compassionate manner to yourself. So when it comes to these questions, such as, does it help me live the life that I value? Does it add anything to my life? Do I gain anything useful from it? Chances are is that the answer is no. And because you're answering these questions in that moment that you're engaging in that behavior, you're keeping those answers fresh in your mind. And if you're allowing yourself to mindfully experience what's going on inside at a visceral level, you're keeping that feeling fresh in your body. The thing is, often when we engage in the negative behavior, we try to intellectually try to talk ourselves out of it. But here, this is allowing us to remember in a fresh way what the answer to these questions are and what our internal experience is like. So each time we engage in this behavior, this negative behavior, we become mindful, we ask ourselves these questions, we tell ourselves what the answer is to these questions. And every single time we remember more and more. So every single time we engage in a behavior, the answers to these questions are fresh. The negative consequences in terms of how we feel viscerally becomes fresh to us. So we experience at an internal level that we don't want to engage in this behavior anymore. So over time, it takes patience. You pair the behavior with the questions and also paying attention to your own internal experience. And over time, you're going to feel at a visceral level, I don't want to engage in this behavior anymore. Often when we have an urge, a craving, or strong emotion, and it starts to arise and build up, we are often not even aware of it. Usually after the fact, we become aware of what's going on and we start to become critical of ourselves. So how can you start to become aware of it in a moment? Well, often there's a body signal. So say, for example, I have anger issues and the anger starts to arise. I notice that my chest starts to tighten up. So next time I use this tightening of the chest to be a signal to me to become mindful. Oh, I notice there is anger. So often the case when it comes to urges, when it comes to cravings, or whatever it is, often there's tension building somewhere in your body. And that tension starts to become a clue. And it's good to kind of just notice it and name it and just say, oh, I notice that's anger. I notice there's the urge. I notice there is the craving. So when this thing starts to really build up, you're becoming hot with it. So say my anger starts to build up, my body's becoming hot with anger. And when it's hot, it gets really, really intense. So what do I do when it gets hot with anger? Then what I do is I observe it. I sit with it and I observe the anger, or I observe the urge, I observe the craving. And then I could cool down the hotness by remembering the consequences of such behavior that I have. I remember the answers I provide to the questions. I remember how it doesn't feel good. So I cool the hotness by remembering these things in a moment in a really visceral kind of way. So the final thing I want to say here is important, and that this takes time and patience. But this does not mean you're not going to get short-term benefits from practicing to overcome your craving, urge, or the strong, intense emotion that you may have. So every single step of the way, when you are working towards your goal, you will get rewarded. So often people feel like only when I have conquered my habit and I have completely reduced my cravings, then I could feel good about myself. That's not true. When you work on this every single step of the way, and you start to poke a hole in the pattern of behavior that you have somewhere, you're going to gain confidence and you are going to feel better. Over time, you're going to take this habit that you have, which is a complex pattern of behavior, and you're going to be able to dismantle it over time. But each piece of it, each part that you're dismantling is going to be rewarding to you, and it's going to help build your confidence to dismantle the next part of it. So people think what they could do is they could just go cold turkey and just stop their behavior. And that tends not to work. So learning to stop a bad habit is like building any other skill. You're not going to get it perfectly the first time. And over time, you're going to get better and better at it with practice. I'll give you a great example of this. So say that you want to do a split with your legs. You're not going to do that immediately. You're going to hurt yourself if you try to do a split right away. And what you need to really do is that you're going to have to practice stretching. And when you stretch, you need to rest. And then when you stretch again, you're going to have your legs in a position where it's going to get closer and closer to the split. But that's going to take time, and you're going to need to rest in between. And that's the same thing when it comes to working on urges, cravings, or strong emotions, is that you work on it and then you need to rest from it. You don't have to keep pushing yourself all the time. The most important thing when it comes to this, just like when you're working on the split, is that you stay committed. You keep one-minded about it, that you're focused on your goal. You're committed to the goal. If you do it half-heartedly, then you're not going to do the split, or you're not going to be able to address your bad habit or urge or craving or strong emotion. So just stay focused, but know that this is something that takes time. Finally, I want to let you know that I've written an article called Seeing the World as Full of Life. It helps you to be able to look at the world around you in a much more enriching kind of way. I'll have a link to that video down below in the description box. Thank you so much for watching.